In today's video, we're going to tackle the controversial subject of whether I need to list daily on eBay to get sales. Now, we know this subject has been covered a few times in a few different videos, but we wanted to come from it from a different angle today, provide you a little bit of a background insight into our business and why it's important for us to list daily. In today's video, we're going to cover off the history of where all this debate came from, some of the difference between eBay models, and finally whether shadow banning is really a thing if you're ending and relisting. So let's talk a little bit about the history of where this debate has come from. A little while ago, eBay ran an eBay All Ears roadshow over across a couple states in Australia. Unfortunately, we didn't get to go, but however, there was a question that was raised by one of the guests about if I list daily, will that actually help my sales? And the answer from the panel was essentially no. However, don't kick off your shoes, clear your listing schedule for the next week, because I think you need to hear this before you make that decision. Before we get into this discussion, I want to break down selling into two categories. I want to break it down into what I'm going to call retail, which is essentially selling new multi-quantity items. So you're buying from a wholesaler or somewhere like that and selling it on eBay. The second category I'm going to call second-hand, where you're just selling sort of one-off pre-owned items. You might have a new item here and there, but generally you're finding one item and selling it on eBay. Now, why I think these distinctions are important is because of part of the way eBay's search algorithm works. We'll get into that in a sec. And the other point I want to make here is, as second-hand sellers, we are a very small part of the market. And while I can kind of understand that advice as a retailer, I don't necessarily think that applies to us as second-hand sellers. And before you start thinking, well, you guys only sell secondhand stuff, what would you know about being a retailer? That's probably a fair assumption, but I'll let you in on a little secret. A couple years ago, we actually started a secondary eBay store that was focused purely on importing and selling stuff on eBay. So we have had some experience in this space, so we do have a base understanding of what this looks like. Okay, let's talk a little bit about that retailer seller on eBay and some of the advantages of having that model. So the base advantages of having that model is that you know when your stock's coming and you know the quantity that is coming into your store. Not only this, but we do know that eBay search rankings do take into consideration sales history. So what I mean by this is, as a multi-quantity seller, if you sell one of an item and you still have 4 in stock, your item is more likely to rank higher in the eBay search than a seller that only has one item and no sales history on that particular item. Now, this is why some people use the out of stock function, because what that means is if you do sell that item and you're able to get more of them, you can add a quantity into that listing that is now down to 0, and voila, you have sales history on that item, and therefore you should rank higher in eBay search than a comparative seller that has no sales history. Obviously, there's a whole bunch of other things that go into the eBay algorithm that will help you rank higher. For example, your item specifics, your return policies, your shipping policies, your photos, your titles, etc., etc. But if you have two sellers with the exact same policies, the exact same type of listing, the seller with the sales history will naturally rank higher than the person without that sales history. So what that means is, as a retail seller, your listing is more likely to show in the top of search rank than me as a second-hand seller on eBay. So here is the key as a second-hand seller. And before I say any of this, I am not suggesting that you should be staggering your listings out over a period of time as a second-hand seller. What I'm about to suggest to you means that you should be listing as much as you possibly can, as often as you can. So as second-hand sellers, we don't really have that advantage of sitting at the top of rank or close to the top of rank because of those multi-quantity sales and the sales history. Obviously, there are some exceptions to that rule. You could be using promoted listings to help you get up to the top of rank, or you could be the biggest seller in that category, which will help you rank better in those pre-owned categories. And this is kind of why a lot of people niche down in their stores as second-hand sellers. Because if I bring in an analogy here of fishing, and essentially if you think about 5 different fish ponds, and each of those fish ponds has a different type of fish in it. Now, as an everything seller, we've got 5 lines, and one of those lines is going into each of those ponds. Whereas if you're a niche reseller, you will have all of your lines all in the same pond trying to catch the same fish. And if you think of listing as eBay as putting a new piece of bait on your hook, you can now start to see how feeding those ponds as often as you can is hopefully going to catch you more fish. And the difference between a niche reseller is they can constantly keep rebaiting that hook to hopefully catch more fish in that one pond. And as an everything seller, we need to be running around to each pond and adding bait to each hook. And some days we might only get to 4 out of 5 of those ponds because we don't have new stock to list in that last category. Stick with me, I know this is a lot to take in, but essentially that's why people start niching, because they are able to rebait that hook constantly over and over again. Now, I'm not saying that everyone should niche or you need to niche, because clearly we haven't, and that's purely because you're not always able to get the same amount of stock that you need to cover your needs. So you might run out of bait if you're just listing in that one category because you can't source enough of it. Okay, let's drag the retailer back into this conversation. Essentially, a retailer has an automatic rebate. They have 5 lines in the water, but each of those lines has 5 hooks, because once one sells or the bait's taken, still 4 more items that can be sold under the one individual listing. So obviously, if that ranking is higher in eBay search, then that person is more likely to catch all 5 fish than us as a second-hand seller who has to continually rebait and get our listings up to the top of search so people can actually find us. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you guys is there's 2 models here that aren't really comparable in the way you need to approach your business. And if you're a full-time reseller, realistically, there's only 3 tasks that you need to complete in a day. You need to source your items, you need to ship your items, and you need to list items. So if you're not doing that on a regular or consistent basis, then you're probably not achieving the most that you possibly can on eBay. And don't worry, I get it. It's not always possible to list every single day. So I'm going to share with you how we managed to have stock going up in our store 7 days a week, even though we're actually only in the warehouse 5 days a week. And just to add a little bit more controversy into this video, we're going to talk about ending and selling similar. Now, I know recently Daily Refinement did a video about how people are getting shadow banned for ending and relisting items. And we just wanted to talk about whether this is a real phenomena and how you can potentially still do this process, but in a different way that's not going to get your items shadow banned. I do want to highlight that that video was based on people ending and relisting their items. And what I'm about to talk about is ending and selling similar on some of our items. So on Saturday and Sunday, essentially what we do is we go through our older items within a category and we end them. We change some titles, some item specifics, recheck the pricing and adjust if we need to, and then sell similar of those items back onto eBay. So Daily Refinement's video was purely about ending and relisting items. And I'm not really sure if there's any data to prove either way if that is a thing or isn't a thing. But what I can say is I could understand eBay doing that for people that are taking advantage of it, because I know a lot of people were ending their whole store and relisting their whole store just to get that boost in rank again. And I think that's potentially taking advantage and probably not serving eBay in the best way. So I'm definitely not suggesting to end your items and relist them exactly the same. What I'm suggesting, on those days that you can't list for whatever reason that is, you could go into your store, look at your older items, do some refresh on those items, and potentially put them in a better search position than they were before, at potentially a better price point, and hopefully get a few of those out the door. Because realistically, eBay doesn't want old stagnant items sitting on their store. I've heard them talking about how there's dead listings on eBay and how they won't show them in rank after a certain period of time. So if you're making your item refreshed and new and changing a few things, then essentially you're putting your item in a better position within eBay's rank to hopefully get that sale. So I guess all I'm saying in this video is there is kind of 2 categories within eBay sellers, and one doesn't necessarily equal the other. And I think that's probably been missed in this whole conversation, is what actually is happening behind the scenes at eBay. Whether you're actually getting a search boost because you're listing more often or not is probably irrelevant to this conversation. It is more about rebaiting that hook more often as a second-hand seller because you don't have those ranking advantages of multi-quantity items with sales history. And this video isn't to promote hustle culture or anything like that. All we're saying is if you're putting more quality items in front of more people's eyes more often, then you're going to make more sales. So I hope that fish analogy made some sort of sense to you, and I hope this video has helped you understand why it's important to be consistent on eBay as a second-hand seller.